It's rare for a topic to both affect the outside of the story and the inside of the story. But when we talk about the anchoring effect, that's exactly what we're talking about. The way we sell stories, the way we write stories, and important information on how to write stories.
And welcome back to the heart of the stories we tell. I'm Rob, the host, and this is another look deep into what makes a story, a theory on storytelling by a storyteller who believes that every story has merit. And tonight's episode is
The anchor effect. And if you've never heard of it, don't be surprised. Most people haven't. Although I guarantee you, once we go through it, it's affected everyone. So let's get started. Anchoring effect is what's called a cognitive bias. Once you think one way, it's hard to change your mind. Anyone who's ever had an argument with a stubborn person has run into someone who's anchored in place. However, anchoring is also useful. Before we get started, though, for those of you that don't know, what we do here is we do theories on storytelling, but I also do reviews of stories. So, if that sounds interesting, click that subscribe button and anchor yourself in as we tackle yet another bit of storytelling. Alright, so let's forget about the story for a second. Let's pretend you wanted to go and buy something. If you knew that the average cost of something was $50, but then saw it for $30, you'd know that was a good deal. Why? That's $20 less than it's worth. But who's to say what it's actually worth? J.C. Penney's thought it would be a good idea to do what they said was cut the BS. See, as long as they just priced everything as cheaply as they could possibly get it, it didn't matter. But what they found was that people liked those inflated prices. People would rather be told, see this $50 product? It's $40. Even if that meant they would normally only pay $40 for the product. It's weird. And, I mean, it's one of those things that I have an aunt who buys everything the second there's a coupon for it. Because she's anchored in at the fact that that's the correct price. And by getting a coupon that cuts it less, they're paying less. And like I said, these things are things that we handle all the time. Now, I know what you're saying. What does buying things have to do with anchoring? And what does that have to do with telling stories? Well, let's flip that for a second and talk about how this affects what you do with stories. Because it's not just money that you can anchor in place. Let's say you had this really awesome moment in your life where you were happy and everything was great, and during that time period, there was a TV show you used to watch. The nostalgia of it, those happy feelings you associate with it, are all things that have been anchored. So now, when you see reruns of I Love Lucy, you remember the simpler time, the better time. And yeah, that's part of how you market a story. You want to remind people of the good times. So, here's another point. Let's say that you want to try to get that feeling of nostalgia to hit someone. Maybe, just maybe, instead of needing to be a show that you already saw when you were, in your happy time in the 80s, maybe we'll just put the 80s in as part of the setting. Kind of like Stranger Things did. We just covered that a few weeks ago. And I mean, it's far from the only show that does it as a period piece for an easier time. It anchors these thoughts into your head. And psychologically speaking, what we do is we frame entire stories this way. We make you think and feel things. Now, part of the problem of this is that it can backfire. If you had a really crappy time in the 80s, you probably don't have much nostalgia for it. On the other hand, maybe you do. Or maybe, as you look at these images, you get a certain thought. I know I have friends that do. One of my friends is an avid comic book reader. A lot of us are. Because, well, I'm a comic book nerd, so it just kind of comes with the territory. I know other comic book nerds. One of them can't stand Batman. Do you know why? Because his first real reactions and interactions were with Batman fans who talked about, hey, you know who's the best Batman? Batman can do this, Batman can do that. Did you know that Batman's the best character ever? And you know what? It anchored in his mind the fact that there's no such thing as a challenge for Batman. Batman's just this unbeatable bat god. So even though he would have enjoyed the same stories with Batman, he doesn't enjoy them now, because he still associates them with the bad feelings that he anchored in place because of the Batman fan base. Because he sat there and he heard the story about the time that Batman with no superpowers took on Darkseid. I mean, come on, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, if you really love Batman, it's a great story. Now, you know where else this works? Critical reviews. If you have a friend or family member that tells you something's really cool, or if you're constantly being shown, hey, this is a cool story, everybody likes it, you're going to like it. On the other hand, maybe it's the Inhumans and everyone told you that it was going to suck. Or maybe it was Batman v Superman that everyone told you it was going to suck. And you know what happens? You just kinda go with it. You just believe, because you've anchored in place what you believe the actual value of that story is. Now, that's not to say that you can't make up your own mind ever, because of course, we're not computers, we're people. But all you have to do is look at the news nowadays and hear that, well, people shared these stories on Facebook, and because they shared those stories on Facebook, people believed them. That's how conspiracy theories travel too. That's how politics works. That's why we advertise the way we do. That's why you get bombarded with everyone telling you, no, that other one is the bad one, I'm the good one. It's the entire concept of what fake news means. It's the entire concept of why we put trailers out and try to have the trailers affect you on emotional levels. Because we want you to anchor good for us and bad for the others. But all of that is using it as advertising outside of the story. We want to tell you why it's a good story. We want to make you, remind you of things out of the story. What about in-story uses of it? Well, that gets interesting too. Because you see, that is one of the most important things a writer needs to remember. When they're creating a world, especially a world that's different than ours, we need to show, not just tell, what's different. At the time I did my video on Show vs. Tell, I didn't have the word anchoring effect in mind. Although in reality, it's what it did. The Star Trek example I gave, the one where Jericho really was just doing his job as a Starfleet officer and actually was following the rules, well, we had already anchored in our mind that the rules are for losers. Riker and Picard throw them away the minute things get hairy and they need to do something. That's what makes them the heroes. They're willing to take one for the team. Jericho's not. Jericho is actually doing the right thing, though. The same way we anchor in a price point, we anchor in, hey, when a member of our crew's in trouble, screw the rules, we're going to protect our crew member. And, I mean, that's cool. The Orville had an entire episode dedicated to that concept, where the head of security had to learn, hey, I was in charge. If the captain was here, he would have said screw it and do it anyway. One of the reasons that show works so well is because they have anchored into our minds what people are like. I said it in my first review of the show. It's not like people are perfect like in Star Trek. Instead, it's like the Star Trek technology is there, but it's people I would work with in a call center, or at an insurance company, or at a bank. The people worry about things about, can I have soda at my desk? And tell off-color jokes they probably shouldn't. Or are just sarcastic. But we still have the Star Trek mindset. So, she disobeys the rules to save these two, because that's what people do. And that's what Jericho wouldn't do. He wouldn't put the good of the captain and the doctor over the good of the ship and the good of the mission. To give another example, we're going to go way back to when I did the Women of Urban Fantasy as one of my videos. What is urban fantasy? It's fantasy that takes place nowadays, so magic in the real world. One of the things is we can anchor real-world effects, and therefore, we don't need to create a whole world like we do when it's regular fantasy. Because in fantasy, Xena could be anywhere. In urban fantasy, the genie or bewitched are living on a street right down the way. We've already anchored in what world they live in. It's the world we live in, with a twist. In theory, the same is true for superheroes. Now, you might ask why I bring all of this up. Well, I just did a pitch last week for how I would do Dungeons & Dragons anchored in the real world, and the anchoring effect is a big deal with that.
So too did my story that failed to win NaNoWriMo last year, and the one that I'm writing this year, involve the anchoring effect as well. Things that I needed to build in order to make it work. But do you have any questions about the anchoring effect? Or maybe a suggestion as to a way that we use it when we're writing or even just absorbing stories? I'd love to hear, because I want us to work together on this dissection of storytelling. And of course, if you like my crazy ramblings or just thought this was helpful in some way, give me a thumbs up, a share, or click that subscribe button if you haven't already. Join our little community here, one where we discuss and think about whys and hows of storytelling. And in this case, we're thinking about why some things anchor in our head and other things don't. Maybe I'll come back to this at some point in the future if I get enough thumbs up and likes on it. For now, I hope you have a good night, and thank you for walking with me through the heart of the anchoring effect.